There is a version of the Michael Jordan story that has been told 10,000 times, and it is largely true. The 6 championships, the 5 MVPs, the Jumpman logo on a billion pairs of shoes, the man who made basketball the most watched sport on earth. That version of the story exists, and it is accurate as far as it goes, but it leaves out the part that explains how all the rest of it happened. It leaves out the meeting in Oregon, where the most important deal in the history of sports was almost sabotaged before it started. Not by lawyers or competing offers, but by a 21-year-old who did not want to be in the room. It leaves out the moment a corporation tried to reduce Michael Jordan to a product, and what Jordan did about it, not in a press conference, not in an interview, not with a speech, on a basketball court, 63 times. And it leaves out a night in Springfield, Massachusetts, in September 2009, when Michael Jordan stood at a podium in a Hall of Fame induction ceremony, and instead of performing gratitude like a man who had won everything, he did something that shocked the entire sports world. He cried. He named his enemies one by one. He looked toward his high school coach and said, with 25 years of championships standing behind him, "You made a mistake, dude." Some people said that night was petty. Some said it was graceless. Some said it revealed a man who had won it all and still wasn't satisfied. They were all looking at the wrong thing. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand what Jordan walked into when he arrived in Chicago in 1984. Not the version polished by decades of retrospect. The actual version. The one where 2 franchises passed on him, a shoe company didn't really want him, and the city he was supposed to save had already given up. The NBA in 1984 was not the league, you know. It was a league in genuine crisis. Arenas were half empty. 3 games had made it onto national CBS television the entire previous season. 3 games in the whole year. The league's corporate partners were quietly pulling back. The rumor that circulated in ownership meetings, in sponsor offices, in the back pages of business sections, was always the same. The NBA had an image problem. What that phrase actually meant was rarely spelled out in those rooms, but it was understood by everyone who sat in them. The league was perceived as too black for mass commercial appeal, too drug-addled, too far from the tastes of the white suburban consumer who networks and advertisers were spending their money to reach. The Bird Magic rivalry was helping. Larry Bird, the white star from French Lick, Indiana, gave those audiences a character they could root for, and his competition with Magic Johnson gave them a story. But it wasn't enough. The league needed something more. David Stern had just become commissioner in February 1984. He was inheriting an institution that needed not just good players, but a specific kind of player, one who could carry the brand across lines that the game had not yet crossed commercially, one who could, in the language that nobody used out loud but everyone understood, make black excellence safe and appealing for the widest possible audience. On June 19, 1984, at the Felt Forum in Madison Square Garden, the Houston Rockets selected Akeem Olajuwon first overall. A sound choice. Olajuwon would become one of the greatest centers the game had ever seen. The Portland Trail Blazers had the second pick. They needed a big man. They had Clyde Drexler, a guard with a game not entirely unlike Jordan's. They looked at the available players and chose Sam Bowie, a center from the University of Kentucky who had missed 2 full seasons in college with leg injuries. They looked at every scout's report, every performance number, everything available to them. And they looked past the man sitting in the audience in a white suit, the same man who had made the game-winning shot in the NCAA championship as a freshman 2 years earlier, the same man who had averaged over 17 points a game while leading Team USA to Olympic gold in Los Angeles just weeks before. Michael Jordan was selected third by the Chicago Bulls. Here is what Rod Thorne, the Bulls' general manager, said to reporters immediately afterward. He said they had gotten a good player, not great, not transformative, not the thing the franchise had been waiting for. Good. The Bulls had spent weeks before the draft trying to trade that third pick for an established center. They approached Seattle about Jack Sikma, explored multi-team deals involving established veterans. None of those trades materialized. So they took Jordan by elimination, the consolation prize in a draft where 2 organizations had already said they wanted someone else. Jordan sat in the audience and absorbed the information. He was 21 years old. He had grown up in Wilmington, North Carolina, with the Ku Klux Klan active in his county, had been in a racially segregated kindergarten classroom in 1968, had been learning since childhood what it felt like to enter a room and be measured against assumptions that had nothing to do with anything he had done. He knew the particular shape of being looked past by people who had decided in advance what they were looking for. He also knew what he did with that feeling. He had been converting it into fuel for 6 years, ever since a gymnasium wall in Wilmington had told him in 2 handwritten lists what the world thought of him and what it thought of Leroy Smith. But the draft rejection was only the first thing Jordan would have to overcome in the summer of 1984. The second was stranger and smaller, and in the long run, far more consequential. A shoe company in Beaverton, Oregon, needed him to show up for a meeting, and Michael Jordan did not want to go. He had worn Adidas his entire basketball life. He trained in Adidas, wore them off the court by choice, felt no loyalty whatsoever toward the company in Beaverton that called itself a running shoe brand and had a negligible presence in basketball. When his agent David Falk arranged the Nike meeting, Jordan told him directly, "I want Adidas." Falk reached out to Adidas. Adidas was in organizational chaos following the death of founder Adi Dassler, unable to produce a coherent counteroffer. Converse, which dominated the market with 56% share and had Larry Bird and Magic Johnson on its roster, offered Jordan exactly $100,000 a year, the same contract they gave everyone, the deal that said, "You are one of many." Jordan went back to Adidas and made them a direct offer. He told them, "Match what Nike is proposing, and I sign with you." They couldn't match it. The company was paralyzed. His mother Dolores is the one who made him go. She told him it would be rude to turn down the meeting entirely, that he had to at least sit in the room and listen. Jordan packed a bag and flew to Oregon with his parents and his agent, carrying the particular impatience of a man who already knew what answer he planned to give. What Nike showed him in that room changed the answer. The highlight reel came first, footage of Jordan set to the Pointer Sisters' Jump. Not a scouting tape, not a performance review, but a presentation of someone already extraordinary, already undeniable, the game moving through him in a way that made you understand why Larry Bird had already said, early in that first season, that this was the best player he had ever seen. Then the shoe, bold red and black, the Chicago Bulls colors, architecturally unlike anything else on a basketball floor, designed by Peter Moore. Then the name which David Falk had written on a legal pad among other options, Air Jordan. Then the offer. Not a flat fee, a partnership. 5 years, $2.5 million total. Royalties on every pair sold, the first time in the history of American basketball that a player had been offered a financial stake in his own brand, rather than simply a fee for wearing it. Jordan went home and thought about it. He went back to Adidas one more time and laid the offer on the table. "Here is what Nike is proposing. Come anywhere close and I sign with you." Adidas couldn't. On October 26, 1984, Michael Jordan signed with Nike. And then the NBA tried to stop him from wearing the shoes. The shoe Jordan wore in a preseason game at Madison Square Garden around October 18, 1984, was a Nike Airship, a red and black player exclusive that the Air Jordan 1's design was still being finalized around. It violated the NBA's uniform policy, requiring basketball shoes to be at least 51% white and consistent with what the rest of the team was wearing. The league's executive vice president, Russ Granick, sent a formal letter to Nike confirming the violation. The language of the letter was bureaucratic and restrained. It confirmed that the shoes were prohibited, that Jordan would be expected to comply with league rules. What Nike did with that letter is one of the great marketing acts in the history of American commerce. Rob Strasser, Nike's marketing director, a large, loud, strategically ferocious man, read the letter and made 2 decisions. The first, Nike would pay whatever fine Jordan incurred wearing the shoes, absorbing the cost entirely so that Jordan's paycheck remained untouched. The second, they would build a commercial around the prohibition. The commercial showed Jordan's shoes in silhouette, blocked out, censored, forbidden, while a voiceover said, "On October 15th, Nike created a revolutionary new basketball shoe. On October 18th, The NBA threw them out of the game. Fortunately, the NBA can't keep you from wearing them. The logic of the campaign was precise and psychologically sophisticated. It took the image of authority suppressing something and turned it into desire. The NBA said no. These shoes represent no. Buying them means saying no too. For young consumers in 1985 America, that message, rebellion, defiance, the establishment pushing down on something extraordinary, landed with a force that no straightforward basketball shoe advertisement could have matched. The Air Jordan 1 launched on April 1, 1985, at $65 a pair. Within 2 months, Nike had sold $70 million worth. By the end of the year, the Jordan brand had generated $126 million in revenue. Nike's original 3-year projection for the entire venture had been $3 million. What had happened was not only a commercial revolution, it was a structural one. Before Jordan, athlete endorsement deals in American professional sports were transactional. You wear our product, we pay you a fee, the product is ours. What Nike and David Falk had built was something categorically different, a partnership in which the athlete was not separate from the brand, but constitutive of it. The brand was Jordan. The Jordan brand was worth more than the shoes. The shoes were worth more because of Jordan, and Jordan got a percentage of all of it, for as long as the shoes were sold. This model, the athlete as equity partner rather than paid spokesperson, had not existed before. It would be copied, imperfectly, by nearly every major athlete endorsement deal that followed. LeBron James, Steph Curry, every signature line that came after, they are all downstream of the Jordan deal. They exist because a 21-year-old from Wilmington, North Carolina, who had been passed over twice in the same draft month, sat in a room in Oregon and listened to a pitch he had not wanted to hear. But here is what gets missed when the commercial story becomes the whole story. Jordan himself was not comfortable with what he was being built into. He was aware that a version of him was being constructed in boardrooms and advertising agencies that served commercial purposes not entirely identical to his own purposes. The Air Jordan of the commercials was a rebellion symbol, a counter-cultural figure, a young man whose shoes the authorities had tried to suppress. That figure was useful to Nike. It was also, in a very specific way, a management of Jordan's actual identity. The real Michael Jordan, the one who had grown up in a segregated classroom, who had thrown a soda at a girl who called him a racial slur at 14, who had watched Roots that same year and told interviewers decades later that it had made him, for a time, consider himself a racist against all white people. That Michael Jordan was more complicated, more politically charged, more historically specific than the swoosh logo needed him to be. The NBA and its corporate partners wanted something particular from their new star. They wanted what David Stern was building, a product that white suburban consumers could embrace, that transcended the racial anxieties the league's critics had been projecting onto it for years. A black athlete who belonged to everyone, a black man stripped of specific political weight, available for universal consumption. Jordan understood what was being asked of him. He had been navigating versions of that request his entire life. The pressure to be accessible, to not make people uncomfortable, to be black in ways that didn't challenge the comfort of the people whose money and attention you needed. He had been managing that pressure since before he could name it, and he made a choice, which he would defend for the rest of his career. He would answer in performance. He would make the argument with his body on a basketball floor. He would build something so undeniably great that the question of who he was and whether he belonged would become permanently irrelevant. It was a coherent strategy. It was also a strategy that would cost him something. In a Senate race in 1990 in his home state of North Carolina, in ways that he would spend 30 years explaining. But before that confrontation arrived, Jordan had to prove the strategy on the court. And the first proof, the most spectacular individual proof in the history of the NBA playoffs, came in April 1986, in a building that had never seen anything like it, against the best basketball team in the world. Jordan's second NBA season had begun with catastrophe. 3 games in, he fractured the navicular bone in his left foot, a stress fracture that the doctor said required complete rest, complete immobilization, no return to play for the remainder of the season. The Bulls organization said the same thing. Sit down. Let the bone heal. Protect the career everyone could see was going to be historic. Jordan could not sit down. The Bulls restricted his playing time. There were arguments behind closed doors that would contribute to a relationship between player and front office that never fully recovered. He had missed 64 regular season games when the Bulls scraped into the playoffs. He was cleared to play at something approaching his actual level. In the first round, the opponent was the Boston Celtics. The defending champions, 67 wins in the regular season, Larry Bird and Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish, a roster of future Hall of Famers operating with the cold precision of people who expected to sweep this Chicago team and move on to more serious competition. In Game 2 on April 20th, 1986 at Boston Garden, Michael Jordan, wearing Air Jordan 1s in the red and black the league had tried to suppress, on a foot that had been in a cast 3 months earlier, scored 63 points, 63, in a single playoff game against 5 future Hall of Famers in a building that hadn't witnessed anything like it and hasn't since. The Celtics won in double overtime, 135-131. They swept the series. In the arithmetic of wins and losses, nothing changed. Jordan's team went home. In the locker room afterward, Larry Bird sat down in front of reporters and said, "I think it's just God disguised as Michael Jordan." He added, "I couldn't believe anybody could do that against the Boston Celtics." The argument Jordan had chosen to make, the argument of performance, the argument of excellence so undeniable that the question of who he was became secondary, had just been written in 63 points on the most famous hardwood in basketball. And it had been acknowledged by the best player in the league, in the only language that couldn't be argued with. But the argument wasn't finished. It was never quite finished. Because outside the building, outside the game, the pressure to be a particular kind of product was still being applied. And 4 years later, in 1990, it produced the most complicated moment of Jordan's public life. In 1990, Michael Jordan was 27 years old, a scoring machine, the most visible athlete in America, and still trying to win his first NBA championship. The Detroit Pistons, with their physical style, their deliberate targeting of Jordan, their organized collective effort to make the game brutal enough that talent alone couldn't carry a team through, had stopped the Bulls in the playoffs 3 years running. Jordan was carrying everything on his back in a way that was beginning to generate its own critical narrative. He's too selfish. He can't make his teammates better. Individual greatness isn't enough to win the big one. Into this moment came a request from his home state. Harvey Gantt was running for the United States Senate in North Carolina. He was the first African-American mayor in Charlotte's history, a man who in 1963 had become the first black student admitted to Clemson University. He was running against Jesse Helms, a man who had called the 1964 Civil Rights Act, in Helms's own words, the single most dangerous piece of legislation ever introduced in the Congress. A man who had opposed the Martin Luther King Jr. national holiday. A man who had, in a Senate elevator, serenaded Carol Moseley Braun, the first female African-American senator, by humming Dixie. A man whose 1990 re-election campaign ran a television advertisement showing a white man's hands crumpling up a rejection letter, while a narrator said, "You needed that job and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota." Michael Jordan grew up in North Carolina. His mother grew up in North Carolina. He knew the history of that state the way you know, history you didn't read in a book, but absorbed through the specific texture of living in it. Arthur Ashe, the tennis champion and civil rights figure, personally called Jordan and asked him to support Gantt. Dolores Jordan, his mother, the same woman who had told him at 14 that it would be easy to hate for the rest of your life, that you had to deal with what was happening now and try to make things better, asked her son to film a public service announcement for Gantt's campaign. Jordan said no. He told his mother that he didn't know enough about Gantt to speak publicly about him. He wrote a financial contribution to the campaign and sent it privately. And at some point on a team bus with Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant, he said something that was overheard and that would follow him for the next 3 decades. Republicans buy sneakers too. Jordan confirmed in the 2020 ESPN documentary The Last Dance that he had said it, insisting it was a joke, thrown off the cuff, not a statement of political philosophy. He did not back away from the decision behind it. He said, Was that selfish? Probably. But that was my energy, that's where my energy was. Barack Obama, who at the time was a young lawyer preparing for a career in civil rights work in Chicago, appeared in The Last Dance and said what a generation of people who had watched that Senate race had felt. Knowing what Jesse Helms stood for, you would have wanted to see Michael push harder on that. Obama also said something else, something that offered a more sympathetic reading of the position. Jordan was still trying to figure out how he was managing the image that had been created around him and how to live up to it. Jesse Helms won the 1990 North Carolina Senate race by approximately 105,000 votes, 53% to 47. He served 12 more years. Harvey Gantt lost. Now, this is the moment in the story where a simple account would say that Jordan failed his community, that he chose commerce over conscience, that the marketing product swallowed the man. And there are serious people, Arthur Ashe, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Jim Brown, a generation of civil rights thinkers who held that view. They held it seriously and with reasons. But the full account is more complicated. And the reason it is more complicated has to do with something that almost never gets discussed alongside the sneakers quote, what Jordan actually was building while he declined to endorse Harvey Gantt. He was building something that, by the time it was fully assembled, would constitute the most significant accumulation of economic power by a black athlete in the history of American sport. A brand generating $7 billion a year, royalties exceeding $300 million annually, $1 billion in Nike payments over the lifetime of the partnership, the first billionaire in the history of professional basketball, the first black majority owner of an NBA franchise. None of that makes the Helms vote irrelevant. Gantt himself in The Last Dance said he didn't hold it against Jordan, that he had never even reached out to Jordan directly, that the whole episode had been blown out of proportion. But the economic power Jordan was constructing was not nothing. It was a form of argument, different from endorsement, different from protest, different from what Muhammad Ali had done, but an argument made in the specific language that American corporate culture understands and responds to, which is money. Jordan himself framed it this way in The Last Dance. The way I go about my life is I set examples. If it inspires you, great. If it doesn't, then maybe I'm not the person you should be following. Whether that was enough is a question that serious people still disagree about. But what happened next, what Jordan went on to build and win and accumulate, makes the question impossible to answer simply. Because the thing he was constructing turned out to be larger and stranger and more consequential than the commercial product his corporate partners thought they were managing. And the night in Springfield in 2009 was when he finally said so. The championships came between 1991 and 1998. 6 of them, in 2 separate three-peats interrupted by a retirement that shocked the world and a return that felt in the arena like proof of something difficult to name in ordinary language. The first title in 1991 against the Los Angeles Lakers, the second in 1992, the third in 1993. The retirement in October 1993, the loss of his father James Jordan to a roadside murder in July of that year, having shattered something fundamental in the competitive architecture that had always organized his life. Then the return in March 1995, wearing number 45 and not 23, as though he needed to come back as someone adjacent to the man he had been before. The 4th title in 1996, the 5th in 1997, the 6th in 1998, sealed with the last shot of the last game in a championship series he would ever play. A jump shot over Brian Russell with the Bulls down 1 in the final seconds, a shot so precisely executed under so much pressure that it felt less like athleticism and more like an argument concluded. 6 championships, 5 MVPs, 10 scoring titles, 14 All-Star selections, the all-time playoff scoring average, the record for most points scored in a single playoff game set against the best team in basketball in 1986 on a broken foot, wearing shoes the league had tried to ban. And then in 2009, Michael Jordan stood at a podium in Springfield and told everyone exactly what all of it had been made of. Not in the polished language of a corporate spokesperson, not in the gracious, generous register that Hall of Fame speeches usually occupy. In the raw, unvarnished, specific language of a man accounting for every slight he had ever absorbed and every piece of fuel he had converted from it. What he said that night was not petty. It was the most precise description ever offered of how the greatest career in basketball history actually worked. September 11th, 2009. Symphony Hall, Springfield, Massachusetts. The Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Michael Jordan walked to the podium at 46 years old, with 6 championships, 5 MVPs, 10 scoring titles, the Jordan brand generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year, his net worth approaching $2 billion, his status as the greatest player in the history of professional basketball, beyond any serious debate. There was nothing left to prove. The argument was over. He spoke for 23 minutes and cried for much of it. He named the high school coach Clifton Pop Herring, who had put sophomore Leroy Smith's name on the Laney High School varsity list in 1978 and not Jordan's. Not because Jordan had been cut, he went to the junior varsity team where he excelled, but because Jordan had stood at that gymnasium wall, read the list, found Leroy Smith's name in the place where his own should have been, gone home, and cried for a long time. He had actually brought Leroy Smith to Springfield for the ceremony. Leroy Smith, the 6'7" junior who had been taller and therefore had gotten the spot Jordan wanted, was in the audience. Jordan gestured toward where his old coach would have been and said, "I wanted to make sure you understood. You made a mistake, dude." The room laughed, nervously, because they were watching something they could not quite categorize. He named the veterans who had frozen him out at his first NBA All-Star game in 1985, Isaiah Thomas, George Gervin, Magic Johnson, deciding, as veterans sometimes did with flashy rookies, to make him invisible on the floor, to refuse to include him in the flow of the game, to make the newcomer wait. Isaiah Thomas and the Iceman were in the room. They looked, observers said, as unsettled as men facing a man across a court who had decided to score 63 on them. He named coaches, executives, people who had doubted him at various stages with various gestures of insufficient belief. He named them all by name, with specific details, with the precision of someone who had been filing these incidents for decades, organizing them, keeping them accessible for exactly this kind of accounting. And throughout the speech, he returned to the same phrase, "Thank you." He said it looking at Pop Herring's ghost. He said it to Leroy Smith in the audience. He said it to the memory of each person who had told him, in their various ways, that he was not quite what was needed. Thank you. Not sarcastically, with the specificity of someone who meant it. Thank you for the motivation. The sports media's reaction was swift and largely negative. Articles appeared within hours calling the speech petty, graceless, unbecoming of a champion. One prominent sports writer described the evening as a man tripping nerds with lunch trays in a school cafeteria. The headline on a major sports column read, "Jordan's night to remember turns petty." They had spent the entire speech looking at the wrong thing. What Jordan was doing at that podium was not settling scores. He had already settled every score in the only currency that matters in competitive sport. Wins. 6 times he had settled it. What he was doing at that podium was something that elite athletes almost never do in public. He was pulling back the curtain on the engine. He was showing you in real time what the machine ran on. The comfortable story of Michael Jordan, the one the league needed, the one the corporate partners needed, the one the commercial infrastructure had been built around, was a story of transcendence. Jordan transcended basketball. Jordan transcended race. Jordan was for everyone, belonged to everyone, could be consumed by everyone without the discomfort of engaging with anything specific about where he came from or what he had lived through. He was the Jumpman logo, a figure in silhouette in flight, with all the specific details of skin and history and Wilmington, North Carolina, removed. The Hall of Fame speech was Jordan reaching down into the engine and showing you what was actually there. Not transcendence. Fuel. Specific named catalogued fuel. The varsity list with his name missing. The franchise that called him a good player. The all-stars who refused to pass to a rookie. The decades of performing at a level the world could not ignore, while the world kept trying to reduce him to a function, a product, an image, a commercial vessel to be filled with whatever brand message the marketplace required. And he was telling you, through tears, through laughter that came from the audience at his sharpest lines, I remember all of it. I used all of it. I am standing here because of all of it. Not despite the reduced estimation. Because of it. The crying Jordan meme was born that night. The internet extracting his tear-streaked face and attaching it to every failure, every embarrassing loss, every moment of public defeat. The irony is precise enough to be instructive. The man who had used other people's underestimation of him as the engine of the greatest career in basketball history had his moment of emotional honesty about that process turned into a universal symbol of defeat. They reduced him to a product again. He had already won. There is a detail about the Jordan brand that rarely gets included in the commercial success story, and it is the most instructive detail of all. Nike's original projection for the Air Jordan line was $3 million over 3 years, a modest bet by the standards of major sports marketing investments. The actual first-year revenue was $126 million. Today, in fiscal year 2024, Jordan brand generated $7 billion in revenue for Nike. Jordan himself, under the royalty structure that David Falk built into the 1984 deal, received approximately $300 million from Nike in 2024 alone, 3 times more than his entire 15-year career earnings from NBA salaries, which totaled around $94 million. The total Nike has paid Jordan since 1984 is estimated at $2.5 billion. From a deal he almost didn't sign with a company he had never worn, arranged by a mother who told him it would be rude not to show up to the meeting. The deal was structured on the assumption that Jordan would be a very good basketball player. It produced the most commercially powerful athlete brand in human history because Jordan turned out to be something the projection models had no framework for, a man who had been converting the fuel of other people's insufficient belief into performance for so long that it had become the only way he knew how to operate. That's the engine the Hall of Fame speech was describing. That's what the tears were about. Not grief, not bitterness. The recognition, finally, publicly, after decades of doing it in private, of what the whole thing had actually cost, and what it had been made from and what it would have required to have been any different. Michael Jordan was reduced to a product many times over a 40-year public career, by the league that valued him as a commercial vehicle, by the corporate partners who wanted his image without his complexity, by the internet that took his most honest public moment and turned it into a joke, by the sports writers who watched him account for his life at a Hall of Fame podium and called it petty. He had already answered all of them. He answered them the only way that can't be taken back, can't be reframed, can't be edited, for the comfort of whoever's watching. With the work itself. With the 6 titles and the 63 points and the shoes that outlasted the band and the brand that outlasted the career, and the billions of dollars that outlasted everyone who once said he was just a good player. The answer is permanent. It always was. Here is the question that this story actually poses, stripped of the championships and the shoes and the billionaire status and the tears at a podium in Springfield. What do you do when the world tries to reduce you to what it needs you to be? Not what you are, what it needs. The simplified version, the version that fits the commercial requirement, the institutional expectation, the framework that was built before you arrived and that accommodates your talent, but not your full weight. Michael Jordan faced that question from the beginning, before the first shoe deal, before the first championship. He faced it in a segregated kindergarten classroom in Wilmington in 1968. He faced it in a hallway at Laney High School in 1977 when a girl directed a racial slur at his face. He faced it at a gymnasium wall in 1978 when 2 handwritten lists told him that someone taller had the spot he deserved. He faced it at Madison Square Garden in June 1984 when 2 franchises decided that what they needed wasn't him. He faced it in a courtroom-sized marketing suite in Oregon when a shoe company tried to assign him an identity, rebellion, defiance, a black athlete safe for universal consumption. That was useful for selling shoes and only partially congruent with who he actually was. He answered the question the same way every time, not with protest, not with speeches, with work that couldn't be dismissed, that couldn't be reframed, that accumulated into something too large and too undeniable to be reduced to any commercial projection. You might be thinking, That's fine for Jordan, he had the talent. Not everyone has 63 points in a playoff game available to them as an argument. Not everyone can win 6 championships as their answer to the people who called them a good player. And you're right. That form of the answer, the specific, historic, unprecedented excellence, belonged to him and to almost nobody else who has ever lived. But the structure underneath it, that belongs to everyone who has ever been in a room and felt the specific weight of being seen as less than they were, as a function, as a product, as something useful rather than something complete. The structure is this: the people who reduce you are not seeing you. They are seeing what they expect to see, what the framework they arrived with has room for, what their prior assumptions have prepared them to find. They are not wrong about the assumptions. They are wrong about you. And the only answer to that wrongness that permanently sticks, that cannot be revised, reinterpreted, explained away, is the work itself. The specific, cumulative, daily work of being the thing they said you couldn't be, until the evidence is too large for any framework to contain. Jordan did that for 15 years on a basketball floor, and then kept doing it in business and ownership for 20 more. He did it while carrying a specific historical weight, the weight of growing up black in Wilmington, of knowing the Klan was present in the county where he played youth baseball, of understanding from early childhood what it meant to enter a room and have your presence measured against assumptions you had no hand in creating. He did it while navigating a commercial culture that wanted his image on a billion shoes, and simultaneously wanted him to be available to everyone without being too specifically himself. He did it imperfectly, in ways that serious people criticized seriously, in ways that cost real people real things. Harvey Gantt lost a Senate race in 1990, and Jesse Helms served 12 more years, and whether Jordan's voice would have changed, that is unknowable, but the silence was real. He did all of it, and he still built what he built. And what he built now generates $7 billion a year from the sale of shoes, and Jordan himself earns more from those shoes annually than he earned in his entire NBA career. From a deal he didn't want to sign, with a company he didn't believe in, built on a royalty structure that had never been offered to a basketball player before, and was offered to Jordan because one man in a Nike boardroom believed he was looking at something beyond the normal categories. Vaccaro was right. Not because he was smarter than the franchises that passed on Jordan, because he was looking at the right thing. He was looking at the person, not the scouting report. He was looking at what was actually there, not at what the framework predicted should be there. And what was actually there turned out to be something that no projection model in the history of sports had ever accounted for. A man who had been converting the fuel of other people's insufficient belief for so long that the process had become structural, had become the engine itself. If this story landed somewhere in your chest, if you recognize something in the kid at the gymnasium wall, in the third pick at the draft, in the player who responded to being called good with 63 points against the best team in basketball, leave a comment. Tell me what moment hit hardest. Tell me about the room where someone looked at you and saw less than what was there. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing the stories that go underneath the records, the ones about where greatness actually comes from and what it actually costs. Because what Michael Jordan built, the shoes, the championships, the legacy, did not emerge from talent alone. It emerged from talent plus the specific, disciplined, decades-long refusal to accept anyone else's definition of what he was allowed to become. They tried to reduce him to a marketing product. He responded by becoming the most economically powerful athlete brand in human history. That's not a commercial. That's a life.